Morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
So as many people here probably remember, we did all of this fun stuff to change the way people weights work last year. And there were a couple outstanding issues that we did not address on pupil weights. One of them was an ELL study that is not completed yet. And one of them is the pre-K weight that we waited on quite explicitly pending the RAND report. And the Human Services Committee and the Ed Committee are sort of tackling some of the policy parts of it, but we're gonna need to tackle the money weights part of it. And so ask Julia to come in and do like some high level on how the weights work so we can all remember again, and then dive into the pre-K weight. So, floor is yours.
Thank you. For the record, Julie Richter, Joint Fiscal Office. There is a presentation under my name on the committee page. Would you like me to share my screen? Okay. How is that for size? All right.
Delightful.
Great. So as the chair mentioned, here to talk about pupil weights and pre-K in the education fund. So first, I'm just going to do sort of a high-level review of pupil weights. I know that there are some members who are on this committee last year, other members who are not. So really starting high level and then going into more of the details and how they really work in the ed fund, the funding formula. And I'm really going to focus on the pupil weights that are to be implemented next year from Act 127, because currently this is our last, FY24 is the last year of current law, and then we're shifting to the weights. So I'm really just focusing on the weights that we are shifting to. So I'll walk through an example, how they're applied, talk about some considerations of pupil weights, and then dive in a little bit deeper about pre-K in the ed fund, how the pre-K weight works, and how funding for pre-K works within the ed fund. So with that, just digging right into review of pupil weights. So as you might recall, pupil weights are used to adjust student counts by district to account for different student needs or different circumstances and potential additional costs that are incurred for educating certain types of students or addressing certain student circumstances. So, and I'll walk through what the different weights are, what those different categories are, but just big picture, we look at the average daily membership. So that's just pretty much a metric to figure out, you know, how many, on average, how many kids are sitting in chairs during the course of a school day. And then the weights are applied to the certain types of students to account for potential higher costs to the districts for those different factors. So I'm really just starting really high level. This is also a review of how the locally adjusted property tax and income taxes work. So you'll recall that after voters approve the school budget, both the homestead property tax rate and the income tax rate are adjusted by that local adjustment factor. So here, this is looking a little bit different than what we've looked at in the past because we're shifting with Act 127 away from equalized pupils, and we're looking at weighted long-term average daily membership. Mathematically, it's the same, it's just really a new name. So that's the ed spending per weighted pupil, so to speak. And so you'll recall that ed spending per weighted pupil divided, which is a district level factor, is divided by the statewide property yield or income yield. And that's what gives that local adjustment, those different local tax rates.
Yeah.
Just a technical question, Julia, I think. So you've got weighted and then equalized. Once you apply the formula, it becomes equalized?
Great question. So Current law, we have equalized pupils because we're applying what's called the equalization ratio. It's mathematically, it doesn't do anything. We apply all the weights. We then apply the equalization ratio to bring the number of weighted pupils back down. Act 127 said this is just one more step in a complex funding formula. So it did away with the equalization ratio. So starting in FY25, there will be no equalized pupils because there will be no equalization.
Got it. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, any other clarifying questions before moving on? All right. So Act 127 adjusted, so that was the pupil weighting bill. Last year was S287. That adjusted and added pupil weights. So pupil weights were adjusted in some categories from current law to what we're moving into. And those were adjusted for grade levels, students from economically deprived backgrounds, and English language learners, EL is the abbreviation there. There's also new pupil weights that were added, and those are to account for low population density districts. That looks at how many folks are living per square mile in a district. And if it falls within a certain factor, then that sparsity weight, so to speak, is applied. Same with small schools. The only little caveat there is that for a school district to receive the small school weight, they have to be in a sparsely populated district. So this is sort of, if they're in a low population density district, a sparse district, and then they have a small school, then they can get the small school weight.
How do they determine a child is from an economically deprived background?
Great question. Currently, it is using the free and reduced price lunch form. So that's tying back into our universal meals conversation. We were talking about how families were filling out that paperwork to draw down funds from the federal government. Now, Act 127 also implemented the universal income declaration form. So AOE is currently working, I don't know the status, is supposed to create a universal income declaration form to collect the income levels for students to apply, to use that as a metric for determining students from.
I've never heard of that. So every child has to submit one of these income declaration forms for every family?
Great question, and you haven't heard of it because it doesn't exist yet. So it started in Act 127, and so AOE was tasked with creating a working group and then creating this universal income declaration form and figuring out the details of it. Beyond that, I would really say that you should bring in AOE to talk about what that's going to look like on the ground, what the form is going to look like, because I don't know.
And you're being honest.
And I'm being honest.
And then can you help me remember there were also sort of like some default ways of measuring economically deprived background if the form.
Yes, so it was, and I would have to pull up the language to review, but my recollection is that they are to use the universal income declaration form. And then depending on how successful that is, they'll compare it across metrics that are already being used, like the free and reduced price lunch form. So if they're using the universal income declaration form and seeing that they're getting lower counts than they were getting for free and reduced price lunch, then that's meaning that something's not adding up there and that they need to revisit how they're counting that. I don't know if it automatically reverts back to free and reduced price lunch or if that's just another step that AOE needs to take to count kids from economically deprived backgrounds. Anything else on just big picture categories of the weights? Okay. So now we're getting into some more numbers. So these are the specific weights that we were just talking about in Act 127. So you can see the weighting category. Certain weighting categories have different levels. For instance, these are the grade level weights. So there's the pre-K weight, which we'll talk about in more detail, K through 5, 6 through 8, 7 through 12, those are the grades. and the corresponding weighting factor. So that's true across all of these different weighting categories. We've got the economically deprived background weight, the EL weight, sparsity weight. You remember that that's at the district level. So a district is, if they have a sparsity weight, they're only going to fall into one of these three buckets. If they qualify for a sparsity weight, then we look to see if they have a small school weight also applied. And I will walk through an example of how weights are applied because it's not necessarily intuitive. Vermont uses, as most of you are well aware, Vermont uses weighted pupils, unlike most states who use a weighting formula to adjust taxing capacity of a district, not funding levels. And we'll flesh that out in more detail.
Go ahead.
That EL weight is quite high. And I gather there was a third party that they hired to determine these weights. Is there a report on how they determine those weights?
Yes, so great observation. It is quite high. It is the highest, I believe, the highest in the country. And Act 127, as your chair mentioned, did ask to look at maybe breaking up the EL weight, but that study hasn't been completed. There is a lot of documentation from the pupil weighting study. There was a task force that met a lot over the summer and the fall. Your chair was a part of that, I believe a co-chair of the task force, as well as Brett Beck. And it was, the weights themselves were calculated by Professor Colby from University of Vermont and the rest of her team. I don't think I have it linked in this presentation, but I can certainly send you the link to the report.
So there's the original report, there's the and then there's the task force report that was responding to the researchers report. And then last year in the legislation that responded to the task force report, we requested another report that to dive even deeper into the EL weight, given some new data that was available that wasn't available the first time around.
And I was having flashbacks to
Is
last
there a
year.
website for the task force?
Oh, yes, it's on the JFO website.
Okay, I'll
And
just.
it's
I can find it.
it's a pretty fantastic array of information
But thank you.
that Julia had a big part in. And then she stayed and still works here, which is amazing. Representative Meslin.
Yeah, the first pass from Amy Colby, some of us in committee found objectionable, maybe that's too strong a word. Basically, we said, show us your homework. Because they came up with a bunch of weights and it wasn't easy to tell how they got from point A to point B. And last year's work, I think, was a considerable improvement. Although, unless you're a natural born statistician, it's not evident just how all of this stuff works. Right?
I would not agree.
Yeah.
So
Let's not rehash last year right now.
We're not gonna, so we have passed the law. It's being enacted in January, whenever it's being enacted. And then we still have this problem of the pre-K weight. So we want to understand how all these pieces fit together so that we can continue considering the pre-K weight.
Yeah, so as the chair mentioned, the pupil weighting report looked into and addressed all of the weights that we're looking at here, with the exception of the pre-K weight. So you will, if you're really into the weeds of weights, you will notice that the pre-K weight here with Act 127 is different than the pre-K weight under current law, because under current law it's 0.46. Here it's minus 0.54. While they differ, mathematically they're the same. So the pre-K weight hasn't changed with the exception of what it looks like on paper. But from my world of numbers, it's the same. So those are the weights. Now I'm going to just walk through an example of how they're actually applied, because I think that's helpful to understand what we're talking about when we're talking about with pupil weights. So I've created an example, completely artificial, It's looking at two districts, District A and District B. And so this is really just the process of determining the weighted pupil count of a district. So the first step is to calculate the long-term average daily membership of the overall student count in each district. So that means the average of the district's average daily membership over 2 years. So in this example, kept it simple. Let's just say both districts have a long-term ADM of 120. And then we apply the weights to this LTADM for the different types of students that we just talked about for these potential varied costs. And I'll walk through on the next slide how we apply those. And then lastly, we take the long-term ADM, so that's at 120 that we looked at in step 1, and then we add the weighted pupil count, which we calculated in step 2, what we're about to walk through. And then together, the sum of that gives us the total weighted long-term ADM, which is what we're using there for the local tax adjustment. So diving into step 2, applying the weights. This is just going in the wrong direction. There we go. Yeah, okay. So I thought it'd be helpful to just like actually see how the numbers get applied. Again, this is completely artificial. Made it up these districts last night. So this side, columns A and B, should look very similar because that's what we were just looking at. And now we're looking at District A and District B. So in column C here, can you see my mouse when I do that?
Yes.
Okay. So in column C here, this is just the artificial, how is the long-term ADM broken out within District A? How many pupils do they have that fall into different categories? So for instance, they've got 15 pre-K students, they've got 30 K through 5, so on and so forth. So we really just multiply the long-term ADM by the weight factor to give us that weighted pupil count within each weight. Right, so 30 times 0, 0, 30 times 0.36, rounded to 11, so on and so forth. We've also got, I said, okay, let's say that District A is sparse. They've got 53 people per square mile. So that's all of them. So they get an additional 14 weighted pupils, and all of them are necessary as deemed by the law, small school, which gives us another 8 weighted pupils. So then we've got the long-term ADM of 120. We've already calculated that. And now we've calculated the weighted pupils, those different categories. And that gives us an additional 84 weighted pupils. Adding those two together, we get 204. So District A, while they have 120 long-term ADM, when we apply the weights, they're now at 204 long-term ADM. Does that make sense? Are there any questions? All right.
I have one question. And I think you're probably going to tell me if AOE come in, but when the school districts receive their weighted pupil count, is it going to be broken out by these different categories, or are they just going to get one big number?
It's a great question. I'm not sure. I do know that Brad at AOE has been working to apply the weights, and I think that he will send it out broken out by category. And you might recall last year, I did put together a sheet that said, like, by district, what percentage of the district falls into the different categories. So the data exists. I just don't know how the districts receive it.
Thank you.
Peter, Carl.
Because, Julia, these are district values, I suspect there's a problem that might be revealed with disaggregation. If you have multiple schools and populations in the district, which you do now with forced merger, it's the problem of the average of 2 people. One is 4 foot and the other is 6 foot, and the average of the 2 of them is 5 feet. But 5 feet is not representative of either person.
Yeah, so I think that that's really a question down to the.
Yeah, I hear you. It's just, we're switching to realistic weights at the same time. We have created an average student or population by merger.
Yes, I think it's definitely a policy choice.
Yeah.
And I will also say that, and this goes back to the pupil weighting study and pupil weighting task force of, again, thinking about the weights are intended to adjust the taxing capacity of districts and they don't directly correspond with the level of funding that a district receives for a student. And I will talk about this more, but just because of District A has, 31 students determined to be from an economically deprived background, and they're receiving that additional tax capacity, District A is not necessarily getting more funds for those students. That's a district level decision. And that additional tax capacity doesn't need to be applied to educating those students from economically disadvantaged.
And I do believe there's either a section of the report or a section on the task force webpage about a fairly extensive conversation about whether this should be applied at the school level or the district.
I would have thought that would come up.
Yeah. And the original report also explores that a lot. Representative Bodie?
The tiny thing I want to say is that with the EL for 4 students, I think we said that if in the bill, in Act 127, that if you had fewer than a certain number of students, you got a block grant.
Yes.
So that's all I wanted to say.
That's a great nuance, and I should have led with that I'm only talking about pupil weights here. There are other things in Act 127 and in the Ed Fund that provide funding to school districts based on certain additional cost factors that are not only weights. So as you mentioned in Act 127, there was an inclusion of categorical aid for districts that had, I don't remember, but if they had fewer than X number of students, they get X number of dollars.
So I didn't know this, you'd have the weight and the categorical grant.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
But if you were above that threshold, I don't know if it was 50 or 25, I would need to look back at the language. It's also my fiscal note. But it's only if you have fewer than a certain number of EL pupils that you get that additional EL categorical aid.
Oh, sorry, Carl.
No, Julia answered my question in the
Great.
Representative Anthony's comments.
So ADM used to be based on just the numbers from one day. So what is long-term ADM?
Great question. Oh, my arrow keys don't work. It's really throwing me for a loop this morning. Long-term, so it's the average of a district's daily membership, average daily membership over 2 years.
2 years?
Yeah.
Oh, wow, okay. Okay, so another question I had in my mind, which is a problem we used to face in small schools, is if one family with 5 children moves and into another school in the district, won't change district numbers, but it will change what's going on inside the school if 2 need speech therapy. But if it's a 2-year figure, that wouldn't matter.
Yeah, I think that the use of the 2-year, the long-term average daily membership is sort of to smooth some of those changes, especially in Vermont when we have smaller districts than other places in the country.
I can see where that would work well, really. Great, okay, thanks.
I think back to you.
Okay. So I won't put you through me walking through District B in great detail, but I'll just point out, District B has a different breakdown of students in some of these categories. So as you would assume, so too are their weighted pupils in those categories. For instance, District B has fewer 6 through 8 students. So that means that they receive fewer weighted pupils for 6 through 8. And also, District B has the same number of EL pupils, so they would receive the same number of weighted EL pupils. District B is not sparse, so they don't receive any sparsity weight. And because they don't receive any sparsity weight, we don't even need to think about if they're receiving a small school weight as well. So again, we've got the long-term average daily membership, which is the same as in District A of 120. But then when adding up their weighted pupils, we have 38. So we see that while they have the same long-term ADM, they have very different weighted long-term ADM counts. District A at 204 and District B at 158. Again, totally made up.
Representative Taylor?
Why is the 120 across from the 36 to 54 persons? Does that mean, what does that mean
Right here?
yes.
Yeah, so that is saying, I was limited by the space on the slide. So this was saying, okay, let's assume that District A has 50 people per square mile.
Okay, that's, the 36 to 54 is per square mile.
Yes.
Then I understand. Okay, thanks.
Yeah. All right. Okay.
Back to you.
So just some, I think we've already talked through the interpretation of the example, but just to really spell it out. So we just saw that District A and B have the same long-term ADM, but we saw that District A has more weighted pupils, higher weighted long-term average daily membership than District B. So when thinking about intuitively, what does this mean? We can sort of think about it in two ways, and it could be somewhere more in the middle. So in the two extremes, all else equal, if District A and District B have the same education spending, then District A will have a lower locally adjusted homestead tax rate and income tax rate, right? Because those weighted pupils play into that local adjustment. So if they have the same education spending, then District A's locally adjusted tax rate is going to be lower than District B, because District A has more weighted pupils. On the other side of the extremes, the two could have the same tax rate, but different education spending levels. So District A could have higher overall education spending than District B. And because they have more weighted pupils, then they would have the same locally adjusted tax rate. And of course, they could fall somewhere in the middle, right? But that's sort of the two ways of thinking about how weighted pupils play into the education fund and a district's tax rates.
And District A could have more weighted pupils and still have lower education spending too, right? Than District B.
Definitely. Yeah, so that's a good point. So it could even be that, District A could have lower education spending than District B, and then it would have an even lower homestead tax rate. Because again, it's not determined, these weights are not determining how much funding a district is pulling from the ed fund. Okay. So just a couple of big picture considerations. I think I've talked through all of these, but just to sort of keep in the back of your mind that pupil weights directly impact a district's taxing capacity and not the amount of funding that a school district receives. I think we also spoke about pupil weights do not limit how district funds must be spent. So they impact that draw from the ed fund, but don't determine how X number of dollars needs to be spent in a certain manner. That's really categorical aid, which is sort of the other side of the ed fund that we've spoken about. And lastly, Act 127, so that's due to kick in FY25, changed or adjusted pupil weights across all of the categories that we've looked at, except for pre-K.
Yeah, Representative.
Talk to us again about that first one. Pupil weights directly impact the district spending, but not the amount of funding. Well, where does the funding come from?
So
wait, I know. Dumb question. Forget it.
not a dumb question.
I know. Go ahead.
Okay, so
It's like the most important part of all of this. It's like, will you answer it whether she wants you to or not?
yes. And no, it's not a dumb question because I think that this is a common misunderstanding of pupil weights because they're because Vermont is unique in its ed fund formula. So we've thought about, pupil weights are adjusting the tax rate of a school district. But ultimately, that school district is building its budget. It's being voted on local voters. And then the dollars to fund that budget, when taking out offsetting revenues, are coming down from the education fund. So because the weights are not directly corresponding with the funding, with the amount that a district builds, however a district builds its budget, it's just determining the tax rate. Now a district may choose to use those weights, that additional taxing capacity, to raise more funds and pull down more dollars from the ed fund at a lower tax rate. But the district is not obligated to do that with the pupil weights. So the pupil weights are really adjusting the taxing capacity, so how a district can pull funds down from the ed fund instead of saying how many dollars must flow to a school district.
So do the pupil weights, the low pupil rates mean a higher tax rate or a lesser tax rate?
All else equal, the more pupil weights that a district has, the lower its tax rate will be. So if you have so when we look at the pupil weights, so we're looking at these pupil weights here and remembering how they're applied, right? So we have our long-term ADM and then we just add on all of the weighted pupils to get our sum of our total weighted pupils. So we see everything from my cursor down, that's a positive number. So all of that is going to be adding to the weighted pupil count. K through 5 is sort of your baseline, so to speak. So that's not decreasing from your long-term ADM, but it's not adding to your long-term ADM. Pre-K is the difference. So pre-K is the only weight that's negative. So that means that, say that you didn't have, it doesn't make, but the more pre-K students that a district has in relation to the rest of the state, the lower its weighted pupil count will be. So all else equal, the higher its tax rate would be.
All else equal, meaning if two districts have the exact same budgets that they vote.
Yeah, so say that you have two districts. Say you have two districts, exact same budgets. And just for the purpose of the example, I know it would never happen. None of these other weights are applied. So as Representative Sim said, districts of just pre-K students, which doesn't exist, but just for the purpose of the example, you've got these two districts, only pre-K students, same budget, or only pre-K through 5. The more pre-K students that a district has for the same budget, the higher that district's tax rate is going to be.
The more what?
Pre-K students.
Okay, the higher the student population, the higher the tax rate?
So maybe this example is not helpful. So if it's not helpful.
Do you have the fractions, I think like a couple slides ago, right?
Here?
No, further back.
Yeah, oh, here. Great. Okay. I went down a rabbit hole, which may have made people more confused. So ignore what I just said for the last 2 minutes and let's just think here, right? Okay. So this is how our locally adjusted tax rates work. So the committee just passed out, and then the House just passed out the yield bill where we calculated these statewide yields. So that's true across the state. The local adjustment is really determined by this bit that I've highlighted in green. And that's looking at two things. It's looking at your education spending, a district's education spending, and a district's weighted pupils, their weighted long-term ADM. So when just thinking about how fractions work, right? The higher the numerator, higher the top part, the bigger the adjustment is going to be. Same with, or not same, but so when we're looking at this fraction, for instance, education spending is in the top, weighted long-term ADM is in the bottom.
So education spending is just however much a district decides they want to spend and their voters approve.
Right. So then this is the number that we're really talking about here, this
What is-
weighted long-term ADM. So because pre-K is a negative weight, more pre-K students that you have, the more you're going to be shrinking this number down here, right? Because the pre-K students have a negative weight. So the other weights are going to be growing this number. The pre-K weight is going to be shrinking this number.
Representative Bodie?
I'm just thinking that, I'm glad you ended up going down this rabbit hole because I'm thinking about childcare and what might be happening with childcare, which I'm sure.
We're going to get to pre-K at the end of this.
Yeah, that's, we're getting there.
Yeah, so we're in chapter 1 of the presentation.
So I'm glad you did choose.
And then we're gonna move into chapter 2, which is only pre-K.
Yeah.
So this is really, thank you. So this number down here, if it's higher, so the more weighted pupils, right? The lower that the tax rate is going to be if the ed spending stays the same. The lower this number is, ed spending staying the same, the higher the tax rate is going to be. So pre-K is a negative pupil weight. So that's going to be shrinking this number. So then if ed spending is the same, and shrinking this number is going to lead to a higher tax rate. There's a lot of things going on in this equation, and I'm aware of that.
Yeah, at a moment, but not to interrupt this discussion. I read something this morning about a tremor in the force, I guess you could say, with regards to pre-K, what we're doing here and some outside influences that I'd like to talk about without dragging this down another rabbit hole.
Okay, so let's
Postpone it. Yes, Madam Chair.
thank you very much.
So this is a really, while there's only 2 slides on it, this is a really, I'd say in terms of thinking about the ed fund and thinking about the funding of pre-K and everything going on, this is a really lot of information packed into a couple of slides and really important nuanced information to understand the implications. Are there any other questions about this pupil weights in general before we dive into the pre-K weight more? And pre-K funding in general more? Okay,
I think we're ready for it.
all right. Okay. Pre-K funding. So I'm going to kind of take a step back. We're going to start sort of high level again. So we're going to think about how pre-K funding fits into the ed fund. And then we're going to go a bit deeper about different districts and tax rate implications of pre-K funding decisions. So big picture, pre-K is funded through the education fund. And so public pre-K is. And in FY22, using the best data available given to me from AOE, approximately $64 million could be attributed to pre-K expenditures in the ed fund. But this does not include categorical aid. So I'm only talking of that education spending number that we've been talking about, 64 million. And the cost of public pre-K is part of each school district's locally approved budget. But districts decide to do different things, as do parents. And so in FY22, the estimated pre-K per pre-K pupil expenditures, so by district, ranged from approximately 4,300 to 21,000 per pre-K pupil. That means we take the total expenditures of the pre-K expenditures of the district, right? We take how many pre-K students are in that district. And then for each one of those students on average, what is their per pupil spending amount? And that's that very wide range that we're seeing there.
When you say in that district, are you talking about just those that are receiving education at that school?
No, I'm talking about across all districts regardless of their offerings. So this,
And we're gonna get into, I think you're about to get into the offerings.
yes.
Okay. all right,
Yes.
Okay, just want to make sure.
So, so Rep Beck has really led me into this next part of the slide where pre-K costs and offerings really vary by school district decisions and parent decisions. So you've probably heard of maybe you've heard of Act 166. That's that universal pre-K. So school districts must provide at least 10 hours for publicly funded pre-K for 35 weeks a year. How school districts choose to do that varies. And parents can also choose how they want their student to, if they want their student to attend public pre-K, then parents can choose different ways in which they want their student to receive those public pre-K dollars. So there's kind of two big picture buckets that we can think of for public pre-K. One is parents may choose to enroll their pre-K child in a pre-qualified program that's operated by the school district where they live. Some school districts offer full day pre-K programs, others don't. Some offer it a couple days a week, others offer it every day of the week. Varies greatly.
I guess for me, when I think about this, I imagine that's like a pre-K program in a school building that is in some way slightly integrated into the school or not, that it's like operated by school staff on school grounds.
Yes, that is one option. And if you are interested in hearing, I don't have the data of how many schools operate which programs. I would.
Brad just sent that to the Human Services Committee yesterday, and I asked them to send it to you.
Perfect, thank you. So maybe that's a teaser. Yeah, so it differs across pre-Ks.
Yeah, I mean, I can just, as someone who has a child who is enrolled in a pre-K program right now, my local school offers 10 hours a week, 3 days a week, ending at like noon. And as a working parent, it's just very difficult to take advantage of that program as it's constructed. And I think, they provide great programming, and I think they've seen more limited enrollment over the last several years because of, it's just not offered in a way that's accessible for many working families. And so also in town, we have a nonprofit childcare center that offers 5 days a week full day care.
And so then how does the district pay for if someone?
Yeah.
My understanding is we're eligible for the 10 hours of PPK subsidy for the 10 hours that my kids are at that program. And then, we pay out of pocket for the additional.
Exactly. And so that leads into the next bullet point of what parents may choose to do. They may choose to enroll their pre-K child in a pre-qualified public or private program other than a program that's operated in the school district where they live. So needs to be pre-qualified so that those funds, so that it can receive those public funds. And AOE sets the specific amount that the district will pay for the first 10 hours of pre-K education, that tuition amount. So in FY24, next year, the pre-K tuition rate is $3,764 for 10 hours per week for 35 weeks annually. So in Representative Sims' case, as she described, that those public dollars come from the school district to that pre-qualified program for the first 10 hours. And if the parent were to decide to have their child enrolled in longer pre-K, more pre-K than those first 10 hours, then they would be responsible for covering that difference.
My understanding is that there's wait lists in the public school pre-Ks. They're not obligated to take every student?
That is a great question. I don't know. I would have to get back to you on that.
And so there's like a huge amount of policy obviously built into all of this. And there's a lot of questions about sort of like what's the public good around where a child goes to school and all those things, and how inaccessible a program that ends at noon is for someone who has to transport that child away from the program at noon, all those things. Today, I want us to just really understand how inconsistent the amount of money we're spending out of the ed fund is, and the tax rates connected to it are all over the state because of some of those policy decisions and how the weights get applied to it. So we can like have that framing as House Education and House Human Services look at the policy side of that, because the policy is fairly irrational, but the funding for it is maybe even more irrational than the policy is at this point. And I don't mean irrational as like a character judgment. I mean it like, in terms of like
Chaos.
mathematically, yes.
What age qualifies as pre-K? I can't remember.
3 to 5.
Thank you. And then is that on the date of the birthday, or how does that work?
I honestly would need to get back to you on
Right
that.
now, we're just gonna talk about how the math shakes out in wild ways around the state.
Okay. I just want to.
And when getting into pre-K, thinking about childcare and pre-K and all of the other layers that I'm not talking about here, unrelated to the ed fund, a couple of our other analysts at JFO are really the experts on that. Nolan and Joyce have done a ton of work in terms of understanding and modeling a lot of that. But so really the goal of this slide is to talk about how much both offerings and costs vary by district. And because I think graphs can be helpful in understanding, this is a histogram that shows that range that I just mentioned, the pre-K expenditures per student and how they vary by district. So what we're looking at here is the estimated per pupil pre-K spending in FY22. So that's the pre-K expenditures divided by the number of pre-K pupils and the number of supervisory unions or supervisory districts that fall into that bin of pre-K per pre-K pupil spending. So for instance, we see that 6 supervisory unions or school districts are estimated to be spending $4,264 to $6,264 per pre-K pupil, right? 14 supervisory unions, supervisory districts are estimated to be spending $6,264 to $8,264 per pre-K pupil. So on, the rest of the chart can be interpreted in the same way. And I do just, before moving to questions, I want to make 2 notes. One, as Rep. Beck asked on the previous slide, this is capturing all supervisory unions and supervised school districts that I have data for. So this is differing by program offering as well. And not all supervisory unions or districts have been included in this chart due to missing data or data errors that I flagged in the data set that I had.
So interesting to see the wide variety, right? And, resources aren't the only thing that impact educational outcomes, but I think there's probably a strong correlation. It seems like it can be hard to look back at spending to try to understand actual costs, right? That it probably says as much about policy than what is the right amount to spend on kids, right? I mean, it feels so hard to look back and try to glean meaning about. Just feels like during the weighting conversation, often would be like, well, let's look at what people are spending, but that doesn't necessarily tell us what is needed. That tells us the impact of our policy choices on more than anything.
And I think the RAND report was analyzing what is needed, and that's what the policy committees will be doing too. Representative Andrews, Representative Beck.
In pulling together this data, are you aware of what is driving these wildly different costs?
So that's a great question. I think that there's some things that we could infer, or looking at this data, think about, what the different costs could be. We do know that school districts have very varied offerings. But the data itself doesn't have, they're spending, and I'm not sure if this data exists, but X number of dollars for this, for paying this teacher to provide this service to this child. So this is really just big picture, what AOE could glean out of school district and supervisory union budgets, and then forward it to me.
And I think we're gonna go deeper into this, but one big difference is the districts that just pay out the 10 hours a week at the flat rate and the districts that are running their own programs, right? That's those are the two most obvious buckets. I think Representative Beckwith.
Yeah, that is a huge difference. You're sending everybody out and you're getting a 0.46. It's almost a cash cow for the district. But isn't there within the pre-K world, as far as revenues, aren't there federal revenues that are available to certain districts and not others that would also skew this data as far as what the district is actually paying out of education spending? I think
that's a great question. I'm not sure. I know that there is some federal funding, but I don't know to what extent school districts are supplementing spending
I think
with the
there is.
federal
I think
funding.
it's tied to poverty. So there are some districts, I think, that are getting a chunk of change from the feds, which skews their decision up here. They might not be covering it all out of the ed fund, but they're.
And maybe, Julia, that's something you can check in with Ellen and Joyce about.
Yeah.
Sims, Demer.
Can we connect this spending to number of hours of pre-K offered? I know that some schools stick to the 10 hours because that's what's mandated, but some school districts have chosen to offer longer days or more days. Are we able to kind of connect higher spending to maybe school districts that are offering more than the minimum?
I think that would be really interesting and could be very telling. I don't have that data yet. It sounds as though the data has been pulled. So certainly if and when I receive that data, it would be really interesting to to crosswalk those data sets and see the relationship between the two. But as of now, I don't know.
The range here is $18,000. We don't have that kind of a range on our per pupil spending outside of pre-K, do we? And I know it's apples to oranges, but because we've got these other considerations here, like the 10-hour piece, but it's nothing like that, is it?
I don't know off the top of my head the range of per pupil spending. I would have to look that up, which I certainly can do. There is a range
Sure.
in school district per pupil spending, but I don't know if it's 18,000 or a different number.
Yeah.
My recollection, because Berry City's on the low end, it's like 50%, Carl. In other words, the low spending, or let me put it another way, the high spending compared to the low is like a factor of 2. In other words,
Yeah.
the high ones are almost double.
Not a factor of 5.
No, quite so.
And Representative Odie, last one, and then let's get into this because we haven't even added the pre-K weight, which is sort of the remarkable part of all of this. I think. Yeah.
I was just wondering if what are, and this is probably not for you to answer, but something that I'm wondering, maybe some of that difference when you see the 22 versus the 4 has to do with the special services that might be being provided to a special needs child, but I don't know at all if that's true, and I don't know what's required to be provided if you have a pre-K program, if special needs are required at that point, or?
I think that's a policy question that we can ask folks about in our next step.
Okay.
Because there are other funding streams that come in for that.
Yeah.
So we're really just looking at one piece of funding and costs in the whole childcare ether, and that is pre-K and ed fund.
It seems like understanding the per hours is really important here, right? Like the 22 per child looks like a lot more than the 5,000. But it matters a lot if that's over 10 hours or over, 30 hours over the week. And that highlights, right, some huge inequities if some communities are able to offer full day, full care and other communities aren't.
Yes, and we're all paying for all of that.
All of
right?
that.
Yes, yes. And so, yeah.
Yeah, so all of this is coming out of the ed fund. Right, any other questions on the histogram? Okay. So coming back to our conversation of tax rates. So pre-K impacts local tax rates in two ways. Pre-K pupil weights and district pre-K costs directly impact local tax rates. So that homestead property tax rate and income tax rate. And indirectly impacts the yields, but I'm really just focusing right now on those direct district level in the local adjustment. So thinking about the pupil weights. So we've talked about the minus 0.56 pupil weight, which is applied to all pre-K students in each district. And as we've been talking about, that weight is applied to those students regardless of whether the school district offers the 10 hours of pre-K or a full day program or somewhere in between. Those pupils receive the minus 0.56 weight. And also, pre-K impacts that local adjustment to tax rates because the cost of pre-K is part of each school district's locally approved budget. And generally, that's included in the district's education spending. Not factoring in the categorical aid that they're receiving for pre-K or EEE. So a couple of big picture considerations. I think a lot of this has already been spoken about. Just to walk through it, regardless of the district's pre-K offerings, all school districts have the same pre-K pupil weight. So as we were talking about a while back with Representative Brannigan's questions, 2 districts with the same number of pre-K pupils will have the same weighted pre-K pupil count. But say that you've got a district that offers a full day pre-K program and you've got a district that provides tuition for 10 hours per week for the 35 weeks annually, as required in Act 166. Both districts will use the same pre-K pupil weight to calculate their weighted long-term average daily membership. And remembering that those pupil weights impact the tax capacity of that school district. So all else equal, so we're just holding everything constant. We're just thinking about the spending of a district. So the more that a district spends on pre-K, the higher its locally adjusted homestead property tax rate would be. And this is true with other education spending decisions and corresponding tax impacts in the ed fund. That's something that we see, right? That the district education spending and the district weighted pupil count, those are the impacts on tax rates. Questions? That wraps up all of my prepared remarks.
Yeah.
I think I have a question. So if you've got a district that's got an in-school program, and then you've got a district that does not have an in-school program, but is is paying reimbursement to programs that first 10 hour. How is that the ADM calculated? Is it based on the first 10 hours and that's it?
It's based on the number of, so the ADM, the weighted ADM, that's based on the number of pre-K students in that district.
So just the number of students, not necessarily how many days they're, so even if they're 5 days at a private, qualified program, it's for 5 days and then that program is just getting reimbursed for those first 10 hours?
Correct, from the school district's budget. And
Sort of
this,
following up on what you said about the cash cow.
Yeah,
issue.
they get a 0.46.
And and I was not here when we passed it, but my understanding that, and I guess I'm just spreading rumors, so maybe I shouldn't, but that there was sort of intention when we passed the pre-K bill to create this weight in order to incentivize pre-K programs and districts participating in this. And so it was sort of it was understood to be a cash cow at that time. It was a way of sort of encouraging districts to do this. I'm getting nodding from I have I have a shake and a nod, so I will take back, I'm gonna take back my rumor mongering, excuse me, strike it from the record, and we will get testimony on whatever the intent was back in the day. Glad you're both sitting there in the peanut gallery. Carl.
Can I just continue
keep it
that?
going.
So I guess my, what I'm thinking is what is the incentive for the school district to have a program?
Yeah.
If they're just getting all this money to basically reimburse the 10 hours. I guess I'm sure that there's all sorts of pressure. I mean, if there's a need for a program, there's certainly pressure from folks in town, but it just seems like a little bit of a disincentive to me.
Yeah, Representative Campo.
So some districts have a education piece for their high school students to work with the pre-K kids.
And sort of when we mix in all the other weights and all of the decisions that districts make around their budgets, right? And the ability to vote a budget in different ways, I think we wind up with very different decisions around district spending, and sort of what schools want in terms of, and what districts want in terms of services for their students. That results in very different tax rates, right?
Right, and it's not a one-size-fits-all situation anywhere in the state.
And I would also observe, so we have a part-time in-school pre-K in my town, been that way for a really long time. So arguably, they would be potentially motivated to offload that responsibility to a private provider, except for that they can't. Right? People would lose their ever-loving minds if that happened. Like, the community wouldn't stand for it. So it's just an interesting conundrum.
Any other questions for Julia?
I will just say, if anyone wants to, let me know if anyone wants to touch base offline about any other remnant pupil weight questions. Happy to walk through any of it.
This is not the last time we're going to talk about this. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about this week, next week. So I know lots of people have lots of things to say and think about it. We will, I promise, have time for that. We are going to take a break until 10:30. We're going to take a break until 10:30 and we'll come back then.